Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar today about Azure Arc. I'm just going to leave it a couple of seconds to make sure everybody who's registered can join if they're attending to join. And then we'll get started about 1 minute past 10. Thank you. Okay, thanks everybody for joining. My name's Caroline. I'm the head of marketing at IT Champion. I'm just going to take you through a couple of slides before I hand over to Kellyanne, our account director. Just to let everybody know that this session is being recorded. Everyone is muted, but you can unmute yourselves if you want to ask a question later on today. So you should be able to see the screen. You should be able to see the webinar.
I can see it from here.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kellyanne. No problem, James. We'll get you back on. So most people can see the screen. So it is being recorded. If you could post your questions in the chat box, that's what we'll be using today for any questions you have for Mark or Kellyanne. And there will be a post-session email going out with a link to today's recording and anything else that we talk about today. So the agenda is Kellyanne will give you a welcome and introduction from IT Champion, and then we'll hand over to Mark so he can give that keynote presentation about what Azure Arc is all about. He's also going to do a great deep dive into the actual platform so you can see some real world hybrid cloud strategies. And then we'll open up for Q&A later on. So if you do have anything, please put it in chat and we'll come round to it at the end. And we'll make sure that everybody gets a chance to ask any questions they have of Mark. So this is where I'm going to hand over to Kellyanne so you can introduce today's webinar and this what this session's all about.
Good morning, everybody, and I want to thank you for coming along. As I think we actually know nearly everybody on the group, so that's absolutely brilliant. From that basis, we don't have to do a long history of IT Champion. But what some of you will remember is that pre-COVID times, we used to do a lot of technical webinars and seminars, back when people used to be quite happy to come in a room and see other people. And it's just something that we feel that we need to bring back to life. So this is the first one, and we're hoping to do one of these every quarter. Now, basically, the session is designed to be technical, all right? And I know a lot of people on here are technical, and so should enjoy it. Basically, what Mark will do is to run through all the details regarding Azure Arc, and basically how it's utilized and where it can be applied in your organizations. So basically, if I have, as Caroline said, any questions whatsoever, just shout. And I think, Mark, are you ready? And I shall leave you Mark's dulcet Irish tones. Good man. Well done, mate. All right. Right. Okay. So there actually are a few more people joining us. I'm getting lots of messages, so there'll be others dropping in. So, but I'm going to hand over to you now, Mark. And any questions, just put in the chat, and we'll have a conversation afterwards. All right. Thanks.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Caelan. And as you might have seen, my lovely camera is off. I have a secure setting on my laptop, which doesn't allow me to turn on the camera at the moment because I'm in and out of data centers. So what I was going to say, the avatar of me earlier on looks nothing like me anyway. So I suppose the good thing is we're here for the technology. As Caroline and Caelan said, we're going to talk about Azure Arc, and I like to call this Azure Anywhere. And that's really what we're talking about. Azure Arc is allowing us to deliver Azure capabilities anywhere. Now, that's just the start of it. If that's all it was, we wouldn't take as much time as we are today. But there's a lot more than that as well. So I think that's the important thing to have in our head before we jump into all of this. Azure Arc is the ability to deliver Azure services, and probably just as importantly, cloud native services outside of Azure. And I think that's really important. So from that point of view, that's where we want to go. So that's me. The 35 years simply means I've made more mistakes than most. but hopefully learned from a few of those mistakes. And that is the pre-COVID mark. So definitely look a little bit different now. But I suppose my role is to look at multi-cloud and to really focus in on how do we platform workloads. In other words, is it about public cloud? Is it about private cloud? Is it about hybrid cloud? Well, it's all of the above, and it depends on the workload. So there's no simple answer. And I know that's the consultant's cop-out, but I suppose my day-to-day role is dealing with, any size customer who is looking at what's their cloud strategy going to be and how to make that real in that how do we platform and take advantage of technologies like Azure Arc. So that's where we're going to focus. But I don't want you to think from a Dell point of view or an ITC point of view that it's just about Azure. What we're really looking at here is how Azure Arc helps us not only with Azure Public, but also with other hyperscalers, including AWS and Google and multiple platforms on premise. So I think that's quite interesting. Although we're talking about, a Microsoft technology, what we're really talking about is how that technology potentially can help us connect multiple clouds together. And that's quite interesting. So that's, if you like, the premise. And I want you to challenge me as we go along. Now, I only have one screen. So if Caroline or Kaelan don't mind, if there's a question that's topical to where we're at, if you don't mind just shouting them out, or even as Kaelan suggested or Caroline suggested, take yourself off mute. This session, we've allowed plenty of time for questions. We really want to make it interactive. It's not just a presentation. This is hopefully a little bit of a technical deep dive, but still keeping it interesting as well. So I'm going to start off really seriously and say cloud solves everything. And if it doesn't, just say Kubernetes 3 times. And as you can imagine, that's not me being serious. But I think, when we talk about cloud, we have to define what cloud is, because I've often heard the expression, I'm sure you have, that cloud means different thing to different people. Well, you know what? Let's dispel that. There is a definition, a NIST definition of cloud. It's SP 800-145. And that link, and we'll obviously provide the slides after the session when I'm efficient enough to send it over to Caroline. But that hyperlink links to about 12 pages of very boring information. It can be summarized as type, manner, and model. But in reality, we can summarize it even further. Automation, orchestration, self-service, scale up, scale down, and metering. And you might be saying to yourself, hang on a sec, Mark, you said automation, orchestration, self-service, scale up, scale down. How do we do scale down in a private cloud, for example? Well, we can, and there's ways to do that. Not only has the technology moved on when we talk about things like Azure Arc, but the ability to consume the technology exactly the same way as we would consume public cloud is obviously available to us as well. And again, that's something we can talk a little bit about, but again, that's something that you can talk afterwards with Kaelan and his team around how you would do that. Because I think it's important to mention that if we're talking about cloud, whether it's on-prem or in the public cloud or in a co-location, if it's to be a true cloud, it needs to be a consumption basis. And we're not just talking about a lease, because a lease really isn't consumption. A lease is a way, obviously, a financial instrument to pay for something over a period of time. But when we talk about consumption, what we're really saying is that we should have, if we require, the ability to put a private cloud on the ground or in a colo if it has to be outside of a data center. And we should have the ability to set, our commitment and then flex up, pay a little bit more, flex down, pay less. And that does give us the ability to increase and decrease consumption. And I think it's important that when we're comparing where to put a workload, we have to take each workload in itself. So for example, just because the core application for the business makes sense to run on-prem doesn't mean that other applications make sense to run in the same data center. They could, as you know, make sense to run, excuse me, either in a public cloud or somewhere else. So where I want to go with this lovely slide, and I make no apologies for the amount of detail that's on this slide, because this is a tough situation that lots of people have to deal with. And, you know, moving from one platform to another, whether by choice or whether because there's a compelling event like a data center being shut down, or whether the licensing model, for example, makes sense or doesn't make sense. So we're seeing across Europe and globally, I'm seeing a lot of organizations looking at their existing private cloud or hybrid cloud running on Broadcom VMware and deciding, does it make sense to continue? And in some cases it does. In other cases, does it make sense over time to move to another platform, whether that be OpenShift or Nutanix or Canonical or, you know, some kind of automation or orchestration environment. But obviously today's session, you know, if we had a day, we could talk about all the other platforms, but today's session, we're honing very much in on Azure, and we're very much talking, as you can see, when we look at orchestration on the left-hand side, that is about Azure Arc and Azure Resource Management. When we talk about observability, that in addition to logs and metrics is about Azure Arc. When we talk about multi-cloud, again, Arc features. When we talk about cluster management, again, Arc features. So most of us on the call will have heard of Azure Local, and we'll certainly talk about Azure Local, but what's much more important, and hence the title of this session, is if Azure Arc features in all these elements of the stack or the platform, it has to be important. Can we get a good understanding of what Arc can do for us? And can we get a good understanding if the Microsoft approach itself makes sense, or does it make sense to combine my existing platform, for example, VMware, with Azure Arc? And what's the benefits around that? So we're not talking about, you know, let's turn into a Microsoft fanboy and buy everything from Microsoft. What we're talking about is what is the rationale and decision process to decide, you know, do I reduce the cores I have on VMware and use elements of Azure and Azure Arc? Do I remove all of the cores on VMware over a 2 or 3 year period and use the whole Azure platform or stack? Or do I look at another platform altogether? And again, the answer will vary depending on the applications you have, depending on the skill sets you have in the organization. And of course, this is why it's so important to partner with someone like ITC, because having that exposure to multiple customers, seeing lots of different transformations over a period of time allows you to get the benefit of Caelan and the team's expertise and their experience dealing with these transformations. Because let's be honest, as an internal environment, we should not be dealing with transformations every month or every quarter. We should be dealing with that every 2 or 3 years, or depending on when it suits the business. So I think that's why having the close relationship with a partner is so important. That for me is really the crux of delivering this. You know, I've spent 22 years as a Microsoft certified trainer. So I'm obviously very passionate about training and skills, but even pragmatically looking at it, having the right technology, you know, having the right facilities without the right skills and the right, you know, cooperation or partnership, it makes it very difficult to do digital transformation. So moving on from that, what we're very much looking at is this whole idea of, you know, the whole approach, taking this Microsoft Azure-centric view. So this is really saying that if I wanted to look at all of the elements, or if you like, the top elements I should consider in a migration, the infrastructure, the hypervisor, the software-defined storage, the networking, etc., what are all those elements? And again, the bare metal infrastructure, I'm from Dell. It could be Dell PowerFlex. It could be another. It could be hyper-converged. It could be loads of different things. Again, we'll talk about Azure Local, and the main reason we'll talk about Azure Local is because it's an iteration of Azure Arc. It's a pure iteration of what Azure Arc enables. But again, I don't want to get caught up in hardware, which is strange coming from the person from Dell. I want to talk about what Azure Arc can deliver to us. And that's really the key. And that's kind of where I want to go. So if you have any burning questions, any comments, and please realize that you should, hopefully, during the session, get to a point where you're going, I'm not sure what Mark is saying there, or this is new to me. It's going to be very boring if nothing in this session is new to anyone in the session. So don't think there isn't really anything such as a stupid question. Please feel free to ask them. What I'll do is I'll take a pause and have a look at the chat, in about 10 or 15 minutes. But if there's any burning question when I'm on a page, I'd encourage you just to come off mute and just ask the question. What's the worst that can happen? I promise I'll be nice. Okay, so I want to address Microsoft Sovereign Cloud. And to be honest, this is not just really about Microsoft Sovereign Cloud. It's about Sovereign Cloud in general. Because remember, pretty much most of the hyperscalers we will encounter, inside our businesses or in partner land, or for me, across Europe from a Dell point of view, most of those hyperscalers, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, etc., are US-based. So Sovereign Cloud has become a very hot topic. And the reason it's become a hot topic, as we all know, is the whole geopolitical situation at the moment, where there's a lot of concern around potential access to data, from, a European country from the US. So I want to be very clear when we talk about the US Cloud Act, that gives the US government permission to access any data that's held by a US headquartered firm. So if that firm is a US headquartered firm, the US government are entitled, and there's checks and balances there, but they are entitled to request that data. They're also entitled to request that data, and there's no obligation for the person who owns that data to be informed. And that's important, right? Now, for a lot of businesses, that's not a huge concern. Obviously, for government environments, for some environments where there's a lot of intellectual property, whether from a manufacturing point of view or an education point of view or whatever it might be, that can be a concern. And again, there is ways that we from a Dell and an ITC point of view can address that. Again, this is not scaremongering. This is really just explaining the situation. When we talk about sovereign public cloud on the left, and again, this is a Microsoft slide, but Amazon have a similar slide. Google have a similar set of documentation. And in fairness to the hyperscalers, they've done a lot of work to ensure that the data during normal operations stays in Europe. In other words, no spam filters or anything else inadvertently allow the data to go to the US. So that's really good and positive. They also make sure that Data Guardian in the Microsoft case, and Amazon have similar technology, means that the data and the operation and the support is all handled by Europeans based in Europe. And again, that's a really positive step because it avoids a lot of inadvertent risks and issues. And it also, in Microsoft's case, applies to the existing locations. So whether that's UK North or UK South, or whether that's the Dublin data center or the Amsterdam data center, all of those can be labeled from a Microsoft perspective as sovereign public cloud. However, and this is why sovereign private cloud exists, sovereign public cloud, although it's very good, it's a good step forward, it does not guarantee that the data can't be accessed by the US government. Now, again, in most situations, that is not a business risk I need to be concerned about. But obviously, if I'm a government or a military, or I have, extremely expensive intellectual copyright, that may be a concern. So I think that's important. And it's, again, something that we can talk about at length individually if needs be, if there's any concerns. But I want to reassure you that the situation is better than it was a number of years ago. And we've been using things like Azure and AWS and Google for, nearly a decade in some cases. The reason that it's top of mind is not that there's an imminent threat to every single person's data. It's simply because the geopolitical situation is more unstable. So that's just a factor that needs to be taken into account. The national partner clouds, just to explain what that is, from a Microsoft point of view, that's where Microsoft has helped an entity, for example, a German environment operated by Deutsche Telekom, where it operates almost exactly like an Azure data center, but it's wholly owned by Deutsche Telekom, which means then it's not subject to the US Cloud Act, irrespective. And again, that's not surprising that that was first established in Germany with additional sites in Switzerland and so on, as you would expect. So that's just important. Again, I think it's important to take it in a balanced view. If I'm a commercial entity, if I'm an educational entity, if I'm a manufacturing entity, in most cases, the status quo is better now than it was 2 years ago as regards the data doesn't leave the EU. The concern is if I'm high profile or if I'm a government, I may not want to be in one of those data centers because I might be attempting investigatory probe or whatever, but you get what I'm saying. So when we talk about Azure Anywhere, we have to realize we're talking about endpoints. In other words, what we're talking about is Azure Arc or Azure Anywhere means outside of Azure. And what I mean by that is if we had everything in Azure Public, we have no reason for Azure Arc. So if we're a very simple business, let's say there's 20 of us all dotted around Ireland and the UK and Isle of Man and Malta, etc. And, our business is real estate and we give someone a laptop, we give them a phone and everything is in Azure Public. There is no need for Azure Arc. Azure Arc is only required if I want to run or manage services outside of Azure. So that's the first basic piece. But if Azure Arc is involved, I will have a landing zone to land those services. And that landing zone could be Windows Server 2022 or 2025 or 2019 with Hyper-V, doesn't matter. It could be Azure Local. It could be vSphere, with VMware. It could be OpenShift. All of those are valid landing zones. And really what we're saying is with Azure Arc, your intent is to create a connection between Azure Public and your data center or a colo or an edge location. Now, the big question is, why? What's the benefit? Why should I do it? Why should I care? And let's do that. Let's jump out of the slides for a second and let me jump into Azure and have a look. So before I do that, let me just check if there's any questions available. And I can see we have loads of questions, guys. There's tons of, no, I'm just being facetious. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to either put them in the chat or come off mute. Now, let me jump into Azure itself. And again, please let me know if you can't see Azure, but you should be able to see Azure on my screen, full screen. I'm in Azure Public. And what we really want to do is we've defined Azure Arc as a connection to Azure to deliver services, in other words, Azure services closer to where I need them, or as a control plane. So what does that mean? Well, if we have a very quick look here, I've got, as you can see, a vCenter. In other words, this is a VMware cluster created in Germany by my good friend Elmer. This is actually in a Bonn data center. Now, my Azure subscription is in the Dublin data center. As Caelan said, you can hear my dulcet Irish tones or Dublin tones. So my Azure subscription is local to me in Ireland. It's in the Dublin data center. But I've got a connection here, as you can see, to my vCenter cluster running multiple VMs and multiple applications. What's important is this vCenter is not in an Azure data center. It's in a private data center, just like your data center, or in fairness, this is, probably too much to call it a data center. It's 2 racks in a relatively small room in an office building. So effectively what we're saying is, this is my Azure connection or my Azure Arc to vCenter. And how that's delivered is there is a resource bridge for vCenter. It's effectively a virtual appliance, and it connects the vCenter to Azure and then proxies the instructions from Azure to the vCenter in a language that it understands. Now, you might say, so what, Mark? I thought we were talking about moving to an Azure approach or a Windows Hyper-V approach. Well, this is the point, because for most of us on this webinar, it's not simple to change platforms. And we may not want to change platforms. We may be in a situation where we're reducing a number of cores on premise. We're putting some of those applications, we're leveraging SaaS, for example, to replace some of those applications, or we're running some Azure native applications, or there's applications we don't spin up very often, and we're putting them directly into Azure or AWS. So why would you connect Azure to VMware? Why would you use Azure Arc on VMware? And it is fair to say that I can go and do the normal management tasks here that I would normally do. I can go in and I can say, stop, start, delete, refresh, etc. Right? We can do that in vCenter already. So why would you have this? The reason to have this is to have a consistent control plane, not only for what you're doing in Azure. So if you've already got 365, you've already got Azure. If you've got 365, you've already got your identity synced with Azure. If you've got 365, you already have your firewall securely open to connect you to Azure. So the question would be, why not look at this as an option? And again, the important thing from my perspective and Caelan and team's perspective is we're not Microsoft. We're not selling this as this is the best thing since sliced bread. There's some great use cases here, but you have to evaluate if this makes sense in your environment. Because some of the things in Azure Arc, you may have tools that do it already, and they may be more cost effective. They may not. They may make sense. They may not. So really what this is about is understanding all of the capabilities, or at least the majority of the capabilities of Azure Arc, and then seeing if any of those capabilities either help with the existing environment, or in a lot of cases, transitioning to a new environment over time. So just think about it for a second. Let's assume that we've looked at VMware, we've got a renewal in about 2 years' time. We need to make, a very balanced decision on, do we invest in 2 years' time and, put more investment into the VMware solution? And for some customers, that is the right thing. But for others, we may decide, we don't want to go that way. We'd like to remove our dependency on VMware, and we'd like to see if we can transform, for example, into a much more cloud operating model. And that's important, because the reason I was a bit pedantic with the SP800 145 was because a cloud is an operating model. It's not a destination. Because if I just lift and shift 100 VMs into Azure, I've effectively moved to another data center. I've done a colo. Now, if I've an impending event like a data center closure, that's a good deal. But if I've lifted and shifted those 100 VMs and they remain in Azure for another year or two, and I still have data center space and I still have other colo opportunities, if that's more expensive, then all I've done is I've moved the apples around. That's really all I've done. On the other hand, if I lift and shift to Azure and it allows me to close a data center that I've had to close anyway for whatever reason, and over time I can refactor those workloads, replace them with SaaS, remove out, then it makes a lot of sense. But the question is, how do I get help in doing that? And one way to do that is to see if Azure Arc can help. So I'm looking at a virtual machine sitting on a vCenter cluster. Now, all of this is fair enough, but what's probably much more interesting is I'm now linked to Azure. So I can use Azure Insights, I can use Azure Logs, I can use Azure Alerts, and they can be the same across on-prem, VMware, Hyper-V, Linux, Azure, AWS, and Google. So if that VM exists in pretty much the majority of locations I can use today, I can now have a cohesive, straightforward way to manage every single VM, irrespective of which platform it's on. Now, you have to admit that's worth looking into. And to give a more tangible option, Azure Update Manager, and I think most of us could figure out, even if we're not Azure experts, that Azure Update Manager is about keeping your infrastructure up to date, as it says, patching as a service, basically. And as you would expect from any cloud, whether it's any public cloud, I should say, whether it's AWS or Azure, for example, you would expect there to be an automated patching as a service approach, which is very straightforward to use. And normally, if you have software assurance, which a lot of us do, particularly in the education sector, if I have software assurance, this update management is either free or nearly free, but it's not only just for VMs in Azure. That Azure Update Manager can also work on all of the VMs that I've connected to Azure with Azure Arc. So what you can probably see here is I've only actually got 2 Azure virtual machines sitting in a Microsoft Azure data center. The other 31 are actually sitting in various different platforms, including my C4 Lab vCenter and my 2 Azure local clusters. So hopefully this is starting to show that although we're very much looking at a Microsoft technology here, and although just like when we go to, a horse race or, a dance, you have to eventually either have a dance or, place a small bet on a horse to win or something. I suppose what I'm trying to say in a bad way is we do have to pick our horses. We do have to, this idea that we can avoid vendor lock-in for everything, it's a little bit of a pipe dream. We have to make decisions. We have to make choices. And unfortunately, from an internal IT point of view, that is hugely difficult. From my time being an internal IT manager, absolutely understand how tough, or infrastructure manager, in fairness, I was managing machines, not people. But for me, that was incredibly difficult because you have to make a decision at some stage. But what I like about this approach is we're already, most of us, invested in Azure because we've used 365. So even Dell, with over 100,000 employees, no longer uses Exchange servers. We use Exchange Online. And using Exchange Online meant we went from, 1 gig mailboxes to 50 gig mailboxes, literally overnight. And no more 20 or 30 PSTs. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that we have an ability to have our cake and eat it. In other words, there's a lot of benefits to public cloud with scale and back-end services, not only Azure Update Manager, for example. What about Microsoft Defender? Because again, anything that's Arc enabled, I can now use Microsoft Defender against it. Now, depending on my licensing, I may have to pay X euro or X sterling per VM per month. But again, I can evaluate that against my current system. And what's the big deal? The big deal is we now have the same protection going across on-prem, VMware, Hyper-V, OpenShift, Linux, ABC, it doesn't matter, AWS, Azure, and Google. So for me, Azure Arc is really a multi-cloud technology. Although it's owned by Microsoft, although it's delivered by Microsoft, its purpose in life is to create this multi-cloud approach. So if you think of Azure Arc as a control plane, you're not wrong. Azure Arc is very much going to be a control plane. But it goes further, because what we're really saying is, I have, for example, a really good example would be McDonald's. Most of us have been in McDonald's or Burger King or whatever it is in the last couple of years. We've seen these lovely self-ordering screens. Obviously, we know that when we put in our order, that's connected to the point of sale system, that's connected to the ordering system. And on the back end, that's connected back in to the ordering for the whole franchise. In other words, if I own 5 restaurants, across Milton Keynes and Manchester, wouldn't it be great if I have a single view of all of those environments? Well, guess what? I do, because if I go into Azure Arc and go into Manage Resources and Azure Local, that's my 2 restaurants, CLS1 and CLS2, or that's my 2 colleges or my 2 universities. And I'm using the portal, the GUI at the moment. But the real power of this is everything that I can automate in Azure. With Azure Arc, I can now extend that automation outside of Azure to anything that's Arc enabled. So just think about that for a second. If we decide that we want a policy applied to 5 different locations, even a location that just has 1 node, we can have that policy applied at the same time to all of those 5 locations via Azure. We don't have to remote into each of those locations. We can literally work centralized on all of those environments. So it's fair to say when we talk about Azure Arc, it's a lot more than just extending the control plane. It's also allowing you to do cloud native applications wherever you want. Now, we need to define that, just a bit like we needed to define cloud. But again, let me pause, because I'm absolutely, hopefully, opening 1 or 2 kind of, not cans of worms, but, hopefully you're going, oh, I didn't realize that you could do that, or something like that. So if you have any questions, again, I'd encourage you to ask them. Don't be afraid to ask them afterwards. There's no harm in emailing myself, Caroline, or Kaylin if there's any questions afterwards, if you prefer to do it afterwards. But it'd be really great if anyone had any questions they'd like to share. So I'll pause before I do anything else. And I can see that we don't have any questions in the chat, which is absolutely fine. But again, if you have any questions, do let me know. And just to check that everyone's alive and everyone's okay, could I get you to give me a reaction? So if it's going well for you, give me a like. That'd be
I was going to say 10 out of 10 for doing this with the cold. So if you need a glass of water or something, just grab one.
Absolutely. And what we will do is, obviously feel free if you need to take a break, but what we will do in about 10 minutes is we'll pause for 2 or 3 minutes. I'll open the mic, and if anyone needs to disappear, please do. But I think it's just really important that this is making sense for people so far. And if there's something I'm skimming over, guys, and it comes to your attention, don't be afraid to shout, because you can be guaranteed someone else is saying, oh, I'm not going to say it because someone else will say it. So, all good. So, as we said, excuse me, sorry, guys. As we said, this is the Azure portal. I'm in the Azure Arc section. And again, Azure Arc, the Azure Arc section will only show elements that are outside of Microsoft's data center. So if I hit, for example, all Azure Arc resources, you can see that I have Kubernetes clusters, these 5 or 6. I have virtual machines, including AVD, which is Microsoft's Azure Virtual Desktop, or VDI. And I have numerous virtual machines. And I also have physical machines. These are the physical nodes in my Azure local Dell AX cluster, right? And really what we're saying is all of those are exposed as Azure resources. Now, what the hell does that mean, right? Well, what it means is when I look at that resource can be tagged just like any resource in Azure. So if we're looking at Showback, for example, where we're trying to understand what resources people are using and we want to assign a value to those resources, we can do that not only with elements that are in the public cloud, we can also do that with elements that are sitting in our data center or in our colo. And really what I'm trying to get to with technologies like Azure Arc is this starts to blur the line between what we instinctively perceived as cloud and instinctively perceived as on-prem. And really, we have to kind of abandon those terminologies, because what we're really doing here is we're unifying those different, I suppose, previous silos, and we're creating a true multi-cloud. And in fairness, people like me have been talking about this for probably 6 or 7 years, but it's only in the last 2 or 3 years that everything is aligning to make it a reality. In other words, the costs of the technology have come down, the ability to consume it from a proper, OpEx or operating model are there and available. And technologies like Azure Arc and others are providing this unifying glue to connect things together. Now, I want to be very clear, Azure Arc doesn't solve world peace. If we don't have a direction towards Azure, or we don't have an existing Azure environment, then you would pretty much say to yourself, yeah, it's interesting, but it may not be for me. But in my experience, pretty much about 80 to 90% of everyone I come across EMEA, small, big, and small, medium, and large, already have an investment in Azure. And that's obviously because of the history with Microsoft from a business enterprise point of view. Certainly in education, Microsoft has been massively strong. And it's fair to say they've been very supportive of education in the past around licensing and things like that. Although it's fair to say Microsoft licensing could never be considered cheap. But we've no one from Microsoft on the call, do we? But, but where I'm going with this is that this type of technology really removes the idea of separate silos. And the big thing for me is, if I take a look, for example, at operations, you can see that I have lots of capabilities here to manage this environment as regards all of this is coming down from Azure. So I get to put my data where the data needs to be. The data, remember, is no longer subject to the US Cloud Act because it's on equipment that is not owned by the hyperscaler. So the fact that we're using Azure Arc to control it doesn't make it subject to the US Cloud Act. So the reason Microsoft talk about private sovereign cloud with Azure Local is that if the data is physically sitting outside a US hyperscaler, then it's not subject to the US Cloud Act. So that's quite interesting. I can get the benefits of Azure. I can run some services in there, and then I can run other services on-prem. And it can be almost anything that I run on-prem if it's Azure Arc enabled. And I think for me, when I take a look at, monitoring, the ability to set up alerts against thousands of VMs, from a scripting point of view. But in this case, I'm setting up an alert against this particular one. And what I'm able to do is create this and then potentially turn it into a script to apply it to 100 VMs or 50 VMs or whatever it is. So that to me is massively, massively useful. But let's drill into it a little bit more, because that to me is the top line. In other words, that's very much, Mark, you've shown us how to use Azure as a control plane. Does that replace everything we do if this is in our data center? Well, of course not. This is, for example, to put an overarching policy over all virtual machines wherever they exist. But I'm still going to manage them day to day with whatever local tooling I'm using. This could be, for example, to say, instead of doing different patch management in AWS and Azure and on-prem, we're going to consider unifying it all with Azure Auto Update. It could be that I decide I'd like, I don't have a monitoring tool that allows me to monitor Azure, AWS, and on-prem, or the existing tool I have is X per seat per month. Let's evaluate that. So the nice thing about Azure Arc is you don't have to take everything. You can decide what you want to take. So let me give an example. If you're not using Azure Arc at all today, and you're running Windows Server or SQL Server, and your Windows Server is already out of extended support. In other words, you're currently paying for security updates. So extended security updates, you pay the same as the software license per year. Now, again, most of us are not doing that. But one of the benefits of Arc enabling a server, if you do nothing else, is you now get 50% off the cost of those extended security updates. So that's significant if I'm running versions of SQL which I can't update and bring up to a supported version, and I need my extended security updates. What's very interesting is, as we probably know, if I lift and shift those to Azure, I get free extended security updates. But interestingly enough, too, if I put them on Azure local hardware in my data center, Microsoft treats that the same as Azure Public as well. So if I'm running Windows or SQL where I'm paying for extended security updates, there's no good reason potentially not to turn on Azure Arc just to half that bill. So that's a really simple example if you're not doing that already. Now, again, that may not apply to all sectors. I know our friends in Microsoft are very good with education most of the time. I don't agree with every change they've made to licensing from an education point of view, but in comparison to some other vendors, they're pretty good. So I thought that might raise some comments. We'll see if that raises some comments. But anyway, if I just drill into Azure Arc, and I will switch back to the slides now in a second, this is, if you like, where I would add resources. So I just want to show you that if I go to add resources, I've really two areas. I've got the ability to add infrastructure or deploy services, I should say. Now, what's the difference? Why should I care? Well, what's interesting here is infrastructure is effectively virtual machines, Kubernetes, connection as I have to my C4 lab, VMware, System Center if I'm using it, or Azure Local. In other words, what we're saying here is we're now going to reach out to a resource or a server or a cluster that is outside Azure, and we're now going to connect it to Azure from a control plane point of view. But importantly, that's a control plane and metadata. That does not mean we're bringing any of the user data or business data up to Azure. And that's really important. And it's fair to say, for some customers, they're not going to do this because the data, for example, is at top secret level or whatever the equivalent is in the jurisdiction. But it's also true to say that a lot of governments, including the UK government and the NHS, are okay with Azure Arc because it's proven to be very secure, and it means they can run services and manage them from Azure where they wouldn't have put them directly in Azure, if that makes any sense. So you could say we really have multiple levels. Some workloads can go completely into Azure, and they make sense to be in Azure because they're cloud native. And we'll explain that properly in a second, because a little bit like what is a cloud, everyone seems to have a different flavor of what is cloud native. And we might keep that for after 11. But when we talk about this idea of how do I transform into a cloud operating model, it is all about automation and orchestration and potentially self-service if we require it. How do we get towards that? We move away from a hypervisor-focused approach to having an approach that will allow us to monitor, to observe, to manage, irrespective of the location and irrespective of the hypervisor. Now, it is fair to say that Arc can't support every kind of hypervisor you throw at it, but for example, it supports KVM. It supports OpenShift's flavor of KVM. It supports multiple Linux distributions like Ubuntu, SUSE, etc. It supports VMware, it supports Hyper-V, it supports Azure Local, it supports EC2 in AWS, etc., etc. So the point that I'm making here is, again, although it's a Microsoft technology, what I'm doing here is I'm about to, for example, connect in my VMware environment. Now, why would I do that? Well, the reason could be is that we're evaluating moving from VMware, for example, to Hyper-V, Windows Server, or Azure Local. Why are we doing that? Because we're looking at the renewal in 2 years' time, or 60 or 12 months, and we're saying, do you know what? We want to evaluate whether we like working this way. And the really nice thing is, if I enable the resource bridge for VMware, there's no charge. In other words, I've now enabled it. I can now evaluate what it looks like. I'm not interfering with the current operation with vSphere. And what I'm doing is I'm starting to look at the capabilities above and beyond what I would normally expect with vSphere. What I'm also doing as well is I'm also seeing if I'm using, quite a few elements of VCF. Formerly vRealize, now Aria. Does Microsoft, for example, with Azure Arc capabilities and monitoring and etc., help me replace those? Is it, good enough, or is it not suitable for what I want? And that allows me to make a really good decision. So the thing that I'm encouraging, whether it's in a lab or even in a production environment, is, if we have an Azure environment already, looking at Azure Arc, carefully is definitely worth your while, because it potentially allows you to turn around and say, I now can start to get everybody skilled up to work the same way. Now, again, if I don't see value in Azure, if I don't see the investment or worth putting the investment in having a landing zone in Azure or creating a landing zone in Azure, I'm not using Office 365. Well, then we should be looking at other technologies, and that's absolutely fine. And we can help you do that. But for the vast majority of us, I think it behoves us to actually evaluate whether it makes sense or not. That's really what today is about, to give you an idea of the capabilities, to give you an idea of what it can do. It won't fit everybody, and nor would I assume that everyone will take every single service that Arc enables, but it really does open up a different approach to multi-cloud. It also allows me, as someone who's really passionate about reskilling people, to say to people, you can walk before you run. In other words, we may not have used Azure Bicep or Terraform very much in the existing environments, and you may have different automation in Azure and different automation on-prem. Let's see if we can use this to bring the two together. And let's see if we can use this to make our choice of hypervisor or platform really flexible in the future. And in some cases, it means that some customers will end up with two hypervisors. They will run Windows Server, for example, 2025, could be hyper-converged to run, big, heavy, juicy cores for certain straightforward applications, reducing their core count and licensing cost on VMware. But then key workloads that are certified for VMware, they keep on their VMware environment, but instead of running 200 cores on VMware, they're running 46 cores on VMware. And you wouldn't normally consider running those two hypervisors if you had to use the VMware tools and the Hyper-V tools. Let's move away from that, or see if we can move away from that by leveraging Azure Arc, Azure Bicep, etc. And again, it's a journey. I hate to use that word. Let's not say journey. It's, I suppose, something that it is a journey. Let's call it what it is. So it's just coming up to 11 o'clock. Let me pause the content. What I'll do is I'll open myself up, and I would put myself normally on camera. Let me actually do that. Let me put myself on camera, but in a weird way.
Hi, Mark. It's Caroline.
Hi, Caroline.
Tom Jacobs is one of our cloud directors, and he's just put a question in chat. And he said it would be good to understand which of the advanced or paid for features are included or heavily discounted if a customer has software assurance for Windows Server licenses, as the majority of education, government, non-profit organisations will likely have this. So what's your viewpoint on that, and how do we get to understand that?
Really good question. And Caroline, thanks. And thanks for that, Tom. So when we go into Azure Arc, so the first thing is what's free to everybody. So when I jump in and I decide, for argument's sake, that I'm going to add infrastructure. Now that could be creating something as simple as a machine. Now, this is Microsoft, but I'm creating a machine in a connected host environment, which is a nice way to say outside of Azure. So if I say, I want to create that virtual machine, add it to a subscription, give it a name, and then choose one of my clusters, say VMware. Everything I'm doing here, including enabling VMware with the VMware Resource Bridge, or connecting to Hyper-V, or connecting to Azure Local, and being able to do an inventory, being able to do permissions, being able to do everything on this screen, that's free to everybody. So that's the first tier, if you like. Absolutely free to inventory, absolutely free to manage, as in straightforward manage. That's completely free. If you have software assurance, in most cases, you will then go to another tier where something like Azure Update Manager is included, or reduced cost for you. And I'm going to cheat, and we'll see if Mark is right. But things like policy, things like Defender, in most cases, you're going to have to pay. But what software assurance will do is it will say, out of the 10 or 12 services in Azure Local, here's 4 or 5 that is free. So I'm going to use a tool I don't know if anyone has ever come across, Prompt Cowboy, and you may have come across it. This is very useful if you're lazy like me and you've read all the LinkedIn articles that say you should put in really good prompt with description, who, what, why, when, how, and tell the AI what you want. So I'm going to say, to Tom's question, I would like a list of all the Azure Arc services and an indication which ones are free, chargeable, at what cost. Now, you can see this is a really terrible prompt. At what cost, and if I have software assurance, which are free or reduced. Now, everyone here would say, Mark, that's dreadful. That just shows how your brain works. So what Prompt Cowboy does, and again, you don't have to, you can use Google to log into it. There's no cost. What it does, obviously don't put any customer information in it or sensitive information, but what it'll do is it'll do what you're supposed to do, which is situation, task, objective, knowledge. And you can obviously edit this by doing this, but it gives you an approved prompt, and then it lets you choose one of the main AIs. So let's try Gemini, and that should give us, and this is Dell giving out to me, guys, but it's okay. So again, you could use whichever tool you want, but I'm just going to use Gemini there. And what it'll do is it'll give me a better output than you would get from that lazy prompt I put in. So here's our answer. Arc enabled servers free for the core control plane, which is a nicer way of saying what I said. Charge when add-on Azure services are enabled. So monitoring, Defender for Cloud, and Azure Update Manager. And to Tom's question, which is a great question, included at no additional cost, Azure Update Manager, Azure Policy, guest configuration, change tracking are included with Windows server instances with active software assurance. So if you've got software assurance today, which most of us have, either in education and in other sectors, a lot of us have software assurance, you really should evaluate those services because you actually get them included. I was going to say free there, guys, but let's say not free because Microsoft licensing is not cheap, right? But if you have a look here, Windows Server ESU via Azure Arc, this was the piece where I talked about the extended security updates. So there's a pay-as-you-go model here. And what you're basically saying is it's going to be free or reduced. And then the Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes, it's free, as you can see here. But then when you're connecting to GitOps, there's a charge, £2 per vCPU per month, and then data services. And again, I'm going to explain all of these data services at the, not all of them, guys, I won't bore you, but I'll explain them at a high level.
Mark, it's Caroline again. And for those of us who are not with it, with all the new up-to-date phrases, what are Kubernetes?
Fantastic. So Kubernetes comes from the Greek word navigator. And when you see Kubernetes on a website, you often see the kind of ship's wheel symbol. So if I show Kubernetes, if I can spell today, guys, Kubernetes, that's what I get from Norian. This ship's wheel is the symbol for Kubernetes. And the reason it's the symbol for Kubernetes is effectively infrastructure plumbing that allows you to manage and operate containers. And then the next question is, what's a container? Is that right, Caroline? Yeah.
I'm sure. I mean, I know I'm not technical, but I know what
No, but
containers
it's
are.
fair.
But it's like, when would organizations really make that step now to using Kubernetes with their containers and or Kubernetes containers? Why would they do that?
Yeah, and guys, this is not rehearsed at all, but it sounds like it is, because that's exactly where I need to go next. Because what we were saying, Caroline, is up to now, we've been talking about making existing VMs more powerful, right? And connecting policy to them and connecting auto updating to them and all of that goodness. But we're still talking about virtual machines, right? And I think what's interesting is that, and again, guys, if you have to disappear for a couple of minutes, please do. I'll just keep flowing anyway, because it's your time. So to Caroline's point, when are you going to use Kubernetes? And the other argument would be, we're hearing about Kubernetes all the time, but in a lot of environments, particularly on-premise, we're not using them. And the main reason behind that is Kubernetes, think of it like plumbing. Think of it like a really good example, Caroline, we said containers, right? And containers, or at least software containers, are based on the idea that, you know, when we were shipping things around the world, before containers were introduced in the 60s or whenever they were introduced, it was very difficult to move house or to take a car and ship it from one country to another, or take any kinds of goods from one country to another. So as we all know, the international system of shipping things is in containers, whether it's TV screens or whether it's food or whatever else. And those container ships go around the world with those 40-foot containers. And those 40-foot containers are a universal standard that can drop off a ship onto a truck and then drop onto a train or whatever it is. And the reason it works is it doesn't matter what you're going to ship, you're going to put inside a container, right? It's a universal standard. So containers are a much more efficient way to run workloads. Now, just like with every technology that has been released, we were told maybe 5 or 6 years ago, there'll be containers in 10 years' time and nothing else. I don't think so. You know, in the last 5 or 6 years, where we've had mature Kubernetes and mature containers, certainly for a longer time, but certainly in the last 5 years, it's been more mainstream. Production-wise, you're still seeing less than maybe 10% of workloads, you know, and it's probably much small when we talk about so if we take the internet out of the equation and take the public cloud out of the equation, we talk about in people's data centers, most of us are running 95%, if not 98% virtual machines. And please jump in the chat, you know, if I'm wrong on your percentage, but I think the percentage for most of us is going to be somewhere between 95 to 98, if not 100%. But, and here's where it gets interesting. If I go and add infrastructure, I can add Kubernetes clusters. Now, what's the advantage of Kubernetes? The advantage of Kubernetes, if I've only to run 3 or 4 containers, I don't need Kubernetes. It's a bit like saying Mark has a small little ship and his job is to take really expensive cars from point A to point B. He doesn't need to be part of a global freight system, because all he's doing is doing 3 or 4 containers once a week going from the UK to Rotterdam, whatever it is. But if on the other hand, Mark is operating part of a global business or a complex infrastructure where I'm running hundreds of containers that are spinning up and spinning down, I need a way to manage all of that. And Kubernetes has become the de facto way to manage that. The competition was really between Docker and Kubernetes, Docker Swarm versus Kubernetes. And really, Kubernetes has pretty much won out for most organizations. And really what we're saying is the reason public cloud is so fast and there's so many individual services that are available and new services coming on stream all the time is that Kubernetes makes it much quicker to spin up and spin down services. It makes it much more efficient, because instead of having dozens, if not hundreds of copies of Windows Server, for example, you're running a container, which is effectively the environment for the application, its dependencies, and that's all. In other words, there's one container runtime, and then the containers or applications themselves. I could have 3 versions of SQL, if they're containerized, all running together, because I'm not going to get DLL hell because they're all separate in their own container, if that makes sense. There's no chance of the Ferrari in container 1 scratching the paint of the Jeep in container 2 because they're sealed in the container, if that makes any sense. The challenge with Kubernetes is there's hundreds, if not thousands, of pages to set up Kubernetes in an enterprise fashion. There's no VMware or Nutanix or Microsoft of Kubernetes. In other words, there's no simple way to follow a set of installations. Now, I say that wrong. You can take and install Kubernetes enterprise grade yourself, but it normally takes weeks or months. What's really interesting about public cloud is you've always been able to, with Amazon, with EKS, or with Google, with GKS, or with Microsoft, with AKS, you've always been able to spin up a managed Kubernetes service, which is much easier to manage because you're not having to understand the depth of the networking. You're not having to understand how to make it highly available. In other words, you're not doing a lot of the plumbing yourself. And that was why a lot of people said, if I want to run cloud native, and there's that term again, so I don't want to run VMs, but I want to run containers, or I want to run platform as a service, I tended to go to public cloud because I had already set up Kubernetes environments that I could just literally plug into. And in hours or days, instead of weeks or months, I could be up and running. So let me show you what I mean. If I go and say, create a Kubernetes cluster, remember, this is not in Azure. This is outside of Azure. But here's my Azure subscription. I choose my resource group. Think of that like an OU. And let's choose our Kubernetes cluster. So this is for web services. We have a web calendar app, and we need a Kubernetes cluster to run that web calendar app that has been given to us. And basically, the first requirement when we get this new application is you need to run it on Kubernetes. So I want to be very clear. A lot of the industry, including Dell at one stage a number of years ago, said every company will become a software company. My response to that was very professional. Nuts. They won't. But every company will want to be agile. Every company will want to use newer applications. A really good example for me was a German healthcare environment where in a particular hospital, there was an application they wanted for, I think it was a particular kind of imaging, medical imaging, but this application only was available to run on Kubernetes. In other words, it wasn't available as a virtual machine for VMware or a virtual machine for Hyper-V. It was only available as Kubernetes. And at the time, the customer had to invest significant resources in running and setting up Kubernetes before they could even install the application. It would be a little bit like you and me saying, you know, we've lived under a rock the last decade, and we've never come across VMware or Hyper-V or KVM. And someone said to us, well, here's the application as a VMDK, you know, an appliance in VMware. For most of us, if you said, here's an application as a VMDK or a VHD, we'd go, that's no problem. I can just copy the files on and I can spin that up in my VMware environment or my Hyper-V environment if it's VHD. Imagine, though, someone comes to you and says, here's a whole series of containers. Use those. A couple of years ago, the answer was if I had to run it on-prem, and this had to be run on-prem because it was connected to medical imaging, couldn't be run in the cloud, they had to set up their own Kubernetes distribution. They had to set up the networking. They had to set up the plumbing. Now, again, they had a lot of Linux experience, so they got it up and running in about 3 weeks. Now, they could have, using Azure Arc, go, here's my cluster. My custom location is going to be, for example, vCenter, or it's going to be Azure Local. So let's say it's vCenter, right? And then let me do lab cluster 1. So it's going to be lab cluster 1. There's my version number. Now, again, I'm not saying this is completely turnkey. You have to know a little bit, but it's hours or days versus months. And really what we're saying is we want this highly available. We're going to have 7 nodes because that's what, or 8 nodes, that's what we've been recommended. That's our default cloud user account. We put in a key pair for security, review and create, and that's our cluster created. Now, my point is to do that where we hadn't got a managed Kubernetes distro, that would be very difficult. Now, we have equivalences in VMware like Tanzu. We've equivalences in SUSE like Rancher and so on. But the point is, this is a managed instance. It's really easy to set up. It can be connected to GitHub then for updates and so on. And you can have Arc enabled other Kubernetes distros. So if we have to use Rancher or whatever it is, we now have that control plane for modern apps, for cloud native apps. So this is, to my mind, table stakes. And even if we're not using containers and Kubernetes this week, this month, this year, if we're investing in a solution, that we want to last 3 to 5 years, we should really insist that there is a way to easily or relatively easily spin up Kubernetes, because we will want that advantage. And we may require those applications that are only available in containers going forward. So I think it's about future-proofing, and I fully respect that most of us in production are not using Kubernetes today, but that will change. So that's Kubernetes and containers in a nutshell. And I want to be clear, that still is just table stakes. That is the plumbing. That's a bit like saying we've just put in the foundation with the underfloor heating in the house. That's what this is. It's not the be all and end all. So let me just pause. Let me just see if there's any comments, questions, anything at all, because I really appreciate everyone's name. And Caroline, thanks for putting that link in. That means I now get 5 cents for every. No, I don't. I don't. I suppose, for me, where I'm going with that, is literally saying this is all about moving from a hypervisor-centric approach to a cloud-centric approach. That's really what it is. So do we have any questions? Do we have any thoughts? Do we want to see how good I am at managing my avatar? Any comments, questions, or anything at all, guys? This is your moment to say, Mark, you're talking nonsense.
Kellyanne,
I'm impressed you're keeping going when you obviously are ill, but no, it's really good, mate. And having been on many of these kind of webinars, getting feedback is always the most difficult thing. But that's fine. So,
yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right, Caelan. And guys, absolutely. One thing is we respect the fact that a lot of us are thinking now, and hopefully this is opening some thought process. And I know, I did one of these a number of months back where I had 100 people on it, and I had very few comments during the session, but then I had people contact afterwards once they've had a chance to process. So, again, totally not worried. I'm very used to it. I practice with my wife because I start talking about Azure Arc, and I can just see her eyes glaze over after about a minute. So it's all good. Okay, so what I will do is I'm going to change gears now in a second. But just to finish off on the demo for a second, we talked about cloud native. Let's bottom out cloud native for a second. And when we talked about adding services, we talked about infrastructure. And a lot of people have looked at it and said, Mark, that's kind of interesting. And, it's fair to say, and I was going to say, there's Gemini. So let me just, what I should be able to do with that. There's my arch nemesis, by the way. He is really good, John Saville. he's very good videos on Azure Arc. So what I'll do is I won't copy it here. I'll send this later because it won't be clean for that. I'll export the sheet anyway. Okay, and I'll save that for everybody. So just to finish this piece here, we talked about infrastructure. Let's talk about services, and this is really where we start to get into cloud native. So when someone says, you know, this is cloud native, what do they mean? And I suppose there's been all kinds of different explanations thrown out there. Probably the simplest one is to say that we're talking about an application that is designed to run natively in a cloud environment. Now, what does that mean? Typically, what they mean is that the application is lightweight. The application can be started and stopped really fast. A lot of people, when they talk about cloud native, they associate it with microservices, and that's correct, but it goes beyond microservices. So it's fair to say that Kubernetes and containers, you know, is the foundation for cloud native in a lot of cases, just like the foundation for a house is normally concrete before you put up the house. So, you know, most cloud native outcomes don't happen without containers and some form of management, usually Kubernetes. But we start to go a little bit up the chain, because when we look at deploy services, we have the ability, for example, to deploy SQL Server instances. Now, SQL Server instances, as you can see, there's no creating here. I've got connect SQL Server instance, and I've got register SQL Server instances. And what this is about, certainly the connect, is taking existing traditional SQL Server 2022, 2025, 2019, whatever it might be, and connecting that virtual machine running SQL to Azure Arc. Now, the question is always asked, why would you do that? And the main reason you would do it, whether it's virtual or physical, whether it's sitting in AWS or Google, or sitting in VMware, or sitting in Hyper-V, or sitting on Linux, why would you do that? The reason you would do that is you want to make it visible in the Azure portal. You want to be able to assign rules to it from, or policy from, the Azure portal. And you want to be able to manage those SQL servers irrespective of where they are. So that's quite interesting, but it's still not truly cloud native, right? Because again, it's just extending a control plane or a single pane of glass. And I hate that expression because it usually means pane as in PIN as opposed to PANE. However, what is much more cloud native when we look at it is SQL managed instances. And SQL managed instances require, guess what? Kubernetes. So again, if you want SQL managed instances, now managed by who? Managed by Microsoft. So all of us are probably familiar with SQL Azure. What's SQL Azure? Instead of having to spin up virtual machines in Azure, you can connect to a SQL PaaS service that Microsoft maintains that's evergreen. You never have to patch it. You don't have to use auto manage or any update service on it because it's just a connection point. And if I'm doing, you know, relatively straightforward tasks with SQL Azure can be very interesting because instead of having 25 VMs that I have to manage and patch and worry about, I could have 25 connections to the SQL Azure service and let Microsoft deal with the back end. Now, there's a cost to pay for that, which isn't trivial, but it's not excessive. But the main reason most of us don't use it is the SQL Server ends up somewhere else, whereas I may need the SQL Server in my data center or in my university or in my college or in my manufacturing plant because the SQL data is being fed by whatever resource. And up until now, you were kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. I'd love the idea of an evergreen SQL. I'd love it to be managed on the back end of Microsoft, but my data needs to be near my sensors or near my core business application or near my timesheet environment or whatever it is. But this is the beauty of Azure Arc. We've set up our AKS cluster. We now go and deploy a SQL managed instance. And the idea with deploying a SQL managed instance is, again, just like something in Azure, we choose where we want this to be as a resource. We create or put it in the right location. So this right location, if it was available. Now, the reason it's given out to me is I have to create effectively, it's not a resource bridge, but it's effectively a resource bridge to connect it in. And what we're basically saying is that when I go to create that resource, so deploy a service, if I look at the prereqs, I need an Azure Arc data controller, which is effectively a bridge or a resource that connects back to Azure. And really what's happening here is you're using effectively SQL Azure, but you're using it on site or in the classroom or in the university or whatever it is. But guess what? Microsoft is responsible for keeping it evergreen. We never have to patch it. We never have to worry about it. And guess what? Our data is ours. Now, that to me is very interesting because that means that if I have multiple edge locations and I'm running multiple things that require SQL, I have my managed Kubernetes set up relatively quickly. I spun up my SQL managed instances. And in the background, Microsoft is keeping those SQL managed instances up to date and evergreen and patched. I don't have to worry about them. I don't have to back them up. I don't have to do any of that because they're effectively the, now I'll keep a copy of the configuration, but they're effectively treated as a service. And then with my data, I'm just connecting to those connection strings and I'm spinning them more instances if I need more. I'm spinning that down if I need less. Now, do I pay for that service? Yes, I do, but I pay significantly less than I would in Azure because I don't have to pay for the consumption of resources, as in storage and CPU, because the storage and CPU is, guess what? On my VMware platform or on my Azure local platform or on my Hyper-V platform. So that's quite interesting because SQL is there everywhere. So what other services have we got? Well, Postgres was there. That has been deprecated. That was quite interesting because a lot of us were very keen for an Oracle replacement, and that's what Postgres SQL allowed us to do. But it's fair to say that Postgres SQL is being deprecated. So, you know, Microsoft run their Ignite kind of their big conference every year in November. So we're all waiting with bated breath to see what, if any, replacement there will be for Postgres SQL, because Oracle is still a big challenge for some people, and people are looking for alternatives to Oracle. You also have web apps, logic apps, functions, etc., container apps. AI is also an option as well. Now, it's not on this list, but the point about it is all of these require Kubernetes. And basically what you're saying is a lot of us are familiar with Internet Information Server. And again, good solution to create basic websites, but I had to manage it. I had to patch it. I had to update the IIS server. What we're saying here is this is just like web apps in Azure. The backend is maintained by Microsoft. In this case, we're platforming it on AKS cluster on our own environment. And then Microsoft is trickle updating and keeping that evergreen and managing the backend platform. So it's fair to say, uniquely, this is true hybrid. Does that make sense? This is really hybrid because the backend, although it's sitting in your data center, it's been trickle updated from Azure. Your data never touches Azure or is never accessible from Azure, but you have the ability to manage everything as if it was sitting in Azure. I have a really technical term for that, and I'm going to try this, and I want your reaction, good, bad, or indifferent. This is really technical. Have your cake and eat it. So please give me a reaction to that one, guys. I'm going to get a lot of frowns, I'm sure, but I'd like to see a reaction to that just to see if we're still there. And the other thing is, if you don't give me a reaction, I'll ask you 3 questions. No, I'm joking. I won't ask you 3 questions. Thanks, guys. Thanks, guys, for coming back. On internal calls, I do that. I actually say to people, if you don't give me a reaction, I will ask a question. So the odd person who's gone for a coffee gets caught out. But I would never do that to a customer. Caelan told me not to do it, so I promised I wouldn't do it. Right, Caelan?
He's typing away to me at the moment, I think, Caelan. Mark.
Perfect.
No, I'm here, always.
No, listen, no worries, guys. And listen, I do, and Caelan and Caroline do, we genuinely appreciate your time to take this amount of time to stay with us. We know how valuable your time is, so hopefully this is useful for you. And I'm going to jump off the demos now because we've been looking at that for quite some time. And I want to kind of make it real with some examples. So let me kind of just hit that really quickly. And again, don't worry with the slide numbers there. We don't have to hit every one of the slides, right? That's not important. So what we've just really been describing is that single control plane. And we've been talking about services, including cloud native services, like SQL managed instances, like web applications as well. So what Azure Arc is doing, in addition to providing that control plane, it's also providing the ability to much more easily run cloud native services, and in particular, Azure cloud native services anywhere, hence the term Azure Anywhere. And really what I was saying here is, and the reason I mentioned Equinix is we probably know 52% of all internet traffic goes through Equinix, right? And the reason I mention it is it doesn't have to be Equinix, but what we're saying is that it isn't 2 choices, public cloud or on-prem in our data center. The other choice is obviously co-location, but what we're not talking about is this idea of, necessarily, renting a particular server. What we're talking about is creating a solution, with ourselves and ITC, delivering that solution into a location that has that 1 millisecond access to the hyperscalers. Now, why would you do that? If there's Azure services like Azure AI, Azure Fabric, for data and data analysis, wouldn't it be great if we could access those services, but not necessarily pay to take the data back out, with egress cost? And of course, one of the ways to do that is to work, with myself and Caelan and Caroline around putting a solution together. And that solution could either sit, in the university or the factory, or it could sit, 1 millisecond access in the same, connectivity to Azure or AWS if you wanted to or needed to consume those services. So the point I'm making is you have choice. 3 to 5 years ago, you didn't. Now you can choose not only private cloud or public cloud, you can choose true hybrid cloud as well. What we want to talk about is some of the landing zones, and it would be remiss of me not to cover Azure Local in any discussion around Azure Anywhere. And it's fair to say Azure Local, if you're not familiar with it, is Microsoft's offering of a hybrid outside Azure environment. It is a HCI platform, 1 or more nodes. This is where Mark gets to show Dell servers, and Michael Dell is kept really happy. But the point I'm making is, as well as having, vSAN or VxRail or 3-tier architecture, it is possible to run Azure Local. Now, does that mean you're running all the services in Azure? Of course not. But you already know how Azure Local is powered because it has, unlike any other platform, Azure Arc turned on by default. But the good news is you're not forced to go down the route of Azure Local. But Azure Local, if you like, is the hero offering that has everything turned on. So the best way to put it is, if I said, I want to have virtualization, I want to have the ability to use Kubernetes, AKS, I want to be able to do, for example, VDI, where I run virtual desktops on-prem, or some of them on-prem because I want to use GPU. If I want all those capabilities, the only offering that can deliver all of those is Azure Local. So I think we've covered this in great detail. This idea of being able to not only control, but deploy infrastructure from the cloud, visibility across all those locations. We talked about logs and analytics, and this idea of Azure Update Manager being able to do one-click updates to all virtual machines, irrespective of where they are. And of course, the idea that Defender in Azure can be brought down to any resource, again, using Azure Arc. And, you know, again, this is for you afterwards so that you have these screenshots and you can have a look at them. From a Dell point of view, because I've been talking about Microsoft for a very long time, what's in it for Dell? Why did Dell get excited about it? Well, I suppose for me, as an Azure architect, the reason I'm here is that most customers, like yourselves, are not, don't have simple needs. There's multiple applications, there's multiple constraints, there's different requirements with different workloads. And that usually means it's complicated. And that usually means we need more than one cloud. That might mean more than one public cloud. That might mean a private cloud and a public cloud, or any kind of combination of those. So from a Dell point of view, our offering for Azure Local is the Dell AX system. And the reason I've mentioned these other platforms, PowerFlex, PowerStore, PowerMax, even Dell VxRail, which is obviously a VMware-focused product, is we've tested all of these platforms with Azure Arc, but not only with Azure Arc, but with the Azure Arc SQL managed instances, those Azure Arc data services. And the reason we did that is a number of years ago, we saw how important this would be. So it might be strange, surprising to know, but Azure Arc is 5 years old, nearly coming up to 6. But it's fair to say a lot of the capabilities have only come in over the last 2 to 3 years. So it's something, from a Dell point of view, we've probably spent close to 4 years now evaluating, testing against our different platforms, because to be honest, this idea of a big bang from one platform to the other, you know, frankly, is not realistic. So again, this is for yourselves, and it really is showing that Arc is connecting not only virtual machines, Windows, Linux, SQL. This symbol here is AVD, so I'm going to talk about AVD very quickly before we finish. Kubernetes, as we mentioned, IoT is there as well, although generally we like to separate IoT from IT. Data services like SQL managed instances, PaaS services like app or web services, machine learning, AI, etc. So really what this is talking about, particularly when we look at a platform or a landing zone like Azure Local, is looking at the ability to run all of these services either now or in the near to mid future. From our perspective, we have taken our technologies and we've also put them in the Azure marketplace. And what I mean by that, and I won't go into it because in the use of time, I don't want to make this a sales exercise. But for example, our data domain is available in Azure and AWS and in Google. Why is that important? Because if I'm in Azure, I don't necessarily have backups, and I may want to have a virtual data domain in AWS. So I back up to AWS. Or equally, I may have the data in my data center, but I may want to put the backup in Azure. We also do that with our block technology, PowerFlex in Azure, and we also do it with our file technology, PowerScale in Azure. And you might say, Mark, why the hell do you do that when Azure has its own files and Azure has its own Elastic SAN? it comes down to size. Dell, as you would expect, particularly with the combination of Dell and EMC in the past, we should know something about storage, having delivered storage for well over 20 years. And the reality is, when we start to get into hundreds of terabytes and tens of thousands of files, the core system in Azure and for files and SAN is very good for small workloads, but for larger workloads, we tend to be more efficient, and we are less expensive at the large scale. And again, Microsoft are very happy with that, because just like Cisco have virtual switches in the marketplace, we have virtual storage and backup protection in the marketplace. And that data domain is quite interesting, because it doesn't matter whether you're using Veeam or you're using Commvault or whatever it is, it's a good target. Now, again, I would preface all that by saying you need to obviously talk to Tom and other people on Caelan's team around what's best for you. I'm not saying these solutions fit everybody. So I mentioned PowerFlex, and it's important to mention it because uniquely, although Azure Local is hyper-converged, in other words, as you can appreciate, there's multiple disks and the data is stored across those disks. In other words, a storage pool created in software. We uniquely have the ability to create storage outside of Azure Local. And again, why is that important? It could be that I have 500 terabytes of storage and I only have 60 cores of compute. If I'm using Azure Local from other suppliers, it means I'll have to have maybe an 8 or a 10 node cluster to get enough disks to give me the 500 terabytes. But if I'm doing it from Dell, it might be a 4 node cluster or a 3 node cluster with the PowerFlex beside it to give us extra storage. So it's just a flexibility thing. It's an engineering thing. And that's not saying anyone else's platforms aren't good. There's great engineering out there and great choice. I already mentioned the block storage for PowerFlex, so that's fine. Really, where I'm coming to now is what I've seen over a lot of discussions, and we talked about this, myself, and Caelan, before we're talking about running the webinar. We want to talk about, some real world examples. And I've dealt with a number of governments and a number of banks and a number of educational institutions where they've looked at Azure Local. What's the use case? And the use case in a lot of cases is that predominantly initially they want to run virtual machines at the most cost-effective way. But they want to be able to transition into a cloud operating model. They've already invested in Azure. They already use lots of Azure services like 365, etc. And they want the flexibility to embrace that approach. And I suppose for me, that's where Azure Local comes in. So Azure Local, it is designed to give you, if you like, the closest experience to Azure outside of Azure. How does it do that? Well, you can see it's enabled by Azure Arc, right? And the good news is most of us on this call, including you, Caroline, are now experts in Azure Arc. More so than most anyway. So...
Wouldn't say that, but there we go.
Well, at least you could get away with a 5-minute coffee conversation on it. But the point I would make is, you now understand Azure Arc. You now understand the capabilities of Azure Arc, at least at a high level. This is what Azure Local is about, is delivering that out of the box. In other words, when I install Azure Local, it connects to Azure. It's an extension of Azure. It surfaces in Azure, and uniquely, the physical servers that make up the cluster can be automatically updated by the auto update for Azure. Whereas if I'm using that with other platforms like VMware and Hyper-V, I can update the VMs on those platforms, but I can't update the physical machines. So if Azure Arc is so good, why do I need Azure Local? It's really just taking Azure Arc to its fullest extent. That's really what it's about. So Michael Dell has now got relaxed. He watches everything, guys, by the way. So he's now relaxed because I've got pictures of servers on the screen. That's my little joke. But you can see we were the first partner of Microsoft's to deliver a premier solution. As you can imagine, there's 1U, 2U, but there's also rugged on the left. And what we're really doing here is we're saying that if this kit was rack stacked and cabled and turned on, it can be deployed from the Azure portal. In other words, exactly where I was creating infrastructure, I can do that not only for virtual infrastructure, but in theory, I could sit in Oslo and deploy something in Manchester if it was put on site, correctly cabled, rack stacked, and initially connect to the iDRAC. In other words, the out of band management, and then when it's on the system, then literally build it from scratch from the Azure portal. So that's very interesting to have that kind of capability. We also integrate our Open Manage. So some of you might be familiar with Open Manage if you use Dell hardware. And we integrate that into Windows Admin Center so that although this is Azure Local connected to Arc, we can manage things like disks, firmware, and the cluster itself locally. And we're not relying on the Azure portal for those things. Of course, the update manager is doing my updates automatically. And I can have this idea, as they do in McDonald's with Azure Local, they manage this as a fleet. They don't manage them individually. And in reality, that's the, I suppose, core kind of pieces on it. From a security perspective, you have a lot more security built in, about 300 settings from a security point of view to make this locked down. Yes, I just spotted it on my screen, 300. You've got Defender enabled by default, and of course, data at rest encryption. So it's a very secure environment, and it has to be because it's part of the private sovereign cloud approach. This is the external storage piece that we talked about. Again, totally optional, can happen at any time. If you have existing PowerFlex, it can be added. And the good news is, check back with the guys in ITC towards December, and there'll be another platform, hopefully, available with Azure Local. I didn't say that. This is being recorded. Please don't share this. Anyway, so with Azure Local, Microsoft have 3 different categories: validated, integrated, and premier. Validated is interesting, but it's only validated once. And for something that's ongoing, as you can see, validated doesn't really give me, availability as a service. This idea of, purchase, not purchasing the environment, but being able to treat it like Azure. In other words, I'm going to put a 4-node environment into the university, and I'm going to be charged X per month, and if we do it right, less than I'd be charged in Azure. And if I use a little bit more, I pay a little bit more. If I use a little bit less, I come down to what I've committed to, 50% or 60%. And it means that on site, I could have 4 nodes, but in reality, because I've committed to 50 or 60%, I'm only paying for 2 nodes. And that's on Dell. So there's lots of different ways to look at this. Above and beyond Premier, the external storage support. So again, I don't want to turn this into a sales pitch. You can see these slides yourselves later and after beyond. What I'd like to do is go away from the slides and talk about a unique use case for Azure Local, and just to show you what it looks like. So if I jump in and let me jump back to Azure Arc, and let's go into add resources and into Azure Local itself. This is the deployment piece, believe it or not. Deploy Azure Local, assuming it's rack stacked and cabled and accessible. This is the catalog. And again, this is where we want to run Azure services or Hyper-V services, but in a much more managed way, a much more Azure or cloud way than just Windows Server. Now, don't get me wrong, Windows Server, particularly 2025, is a great solution. And those lovely pictures of servers I showed, the 1U and 2U, they'll run Windows Server hyperconverged, or they'll run Azure Local hyperconverged. What's the difference? Azure Local is always, not always, but it wants a connection to Azure at least once every 30 days, whereas Windows Server can be totally disconnected, as you probably realize. So if I run the sizer, and again, anyone can run this sizer if they have access to Azure, and a lot of us will have. So let me put that in the chat. So again, you can run this up yourself as I'm doing it. And this is just one, looking at one or two of the use cases. So if I jump back, I can create a new project. And let's look at Intel. And for some strange reason, Mark's going to choose Dell, right? And high availability, N+1. So it's using three-way mirroring. So in a 4-node cluster or a 5-node cluster, for example, I can lose 2 nodes. Assuming I have enough space, I can lose 2 nodes and still be up and running, if that makes sense. So let's assume NVMe. Let's assume we only need 10% growth, not 20% growth. And then we get to define the workload. So for example, general means just VMs. So let's assume we want to run 200 VMs, and we're going to do a 4-to-1 ratio, because I think I'm a bit more conservative than 6-to-1. And this is really saying 6 vCPUs to every physical core. So 6 CPUs to, that's a bit high for me. So 4 tends to be better. We're going to have 4 gigs of memory, and we're going to have 200 gigs of storage. And if I go and add that and click next, that will come back and tell me that's a 2-node AX660. And as you can see there, that's relatively straightforward. The good news is, as a 2-node, it could be switchless, as in there may be no need to provide 2 25 gig switches to connect the storage. We may be able to just use copper to connect them together, and effectively use SPF 28+, just to connect those two together, which makes it very interesting when I've got edge use cases or I need to bring the cost down. Now, let me go change the workload, and I can leave that workload on, and let's add another workload, but this time, this is unique to Azure Local. So of course I can run VMs on, VMware or Hyper-V or OpenShift or whatever, but Azure Virtual Desktop, which is either personal or shared Windows 11 desktops for virtual desktop infrastructure, and to run that outside of Azure, this is unique. And what's unique about it is I can run relatively large environments. So let's say 700 virtual desktops, right? And I'm going to have 100% concurrency, so everyone logged in at the same time. And I'm not going to go for light. I'm going to go for medium, because light is that could be a security guard that just logs into a web portal to look at the access control or update a key, whereas medium would be more like, someone who's using a number of applications at a time. And as you can see, what it's doing is it's creating 22 VMs. It's putting 4 users per vCPU, and it's creating 8 vCPUs in each of these virtual desktops. So this is a unique capability. What's unique about this is that the control plane is still in Azure. The resource broker and everything else is still running in Azure. So we're actually getting a true hybrid application. In other words, we're really going to the steroid version of Azure Arc. Again, Azure Arc powers all this, and Azure Arc can give a lot of the capabilities to any platform. But for example, it's not going to be able to do AVD. So if I do that, I now have my 2 workloads. And again, when I get up into the hundreds of virtual desktop users, would I normally dedicate a cluster to AVD? Possibly. But again, remember, we're using NVMe drives here. We're using fast memory, and we're using, CPU. So if I click next, I now have a 3-node environment that's running all those VMs and it's also running the virtual desktops for my 700 users. And I think that's quite impressive because we're looking at a 3-node environment. Now, it's fair to say they're using high core counts because I'm attempting to run a lot of sessions there. And the memory isn't too bad at one gig. And then the storage is 120 terabytes. So 8 15 terabyte drives. But it's very clear that this is an interesting approach. And just the very last thing, just to show you, literally as the, I suppose, how low you can go. So and this is the same for Windows Server, guys, or Azure Local. So you can see I have Azure Stack HCI, which is Microsoft's name for the OS, or Windows Server. Let's say I want what we call a dual link mesh, which is a fancy way of saying no switches for storage. That's going to be 2 nodes, and they're going to be 1 U each, so small in the rack. And of course, we can bring that processor right down. Let's say it's 8 core, so that's 16 cores per node. I would probably not go lower than 256 because, again, it is Microsoft. And from a storage point of view, particularly if it's a small amount of storage, I would recommend NVMe versus all flash because it's around the same from a cost point of view. And typically, hybrid only makes sense if I have a very large amount of storage I want to run in this platform, because with hybrid, I need cache drives and capacity. So if I'm trying to run a small environment, let's say this environment is something like that, 10 terabytes, right? That's my environment. That's my architecture. 2 nodes. Why? Because I want high availability. Can I deliver this as a single node? Yes, I can. Generally, I'm going to use 2 nodes because I want that high availability. But again, I hope that was interesting. I hope that was useful. And from myself, before I hand back to Caroline and Kaylin, is I really want to thank you for staying all the way through. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's amazing what we've gone through in the last, an hour and a bit to nearly 2 hours. So I'd love to thank you very much for attending today and running all of that for us and showing all those different parts of Azure Arc and what it can possibly do for us. If anybody does at the end now have a question they'd like to put forward, please do in chat. Kellyan, I know, he's just said his battery and he's there. For anybody that's on the call, Kellyan, how can IT Champion do the next steps with them or have a chat about?
Yeah, basically what we'll do, we'll send an email to everybody that was on the call. I think we know 90% of you anyway. And if you'd like to have a chat with Tom or Anne, then we can go ahead and sort that out.
Brilliant.
We're very, very grateful to do that if we can. All right.
If everybody would like to please thank Mark for his time today, all the way from lovely Ireland. I don't know what the weather is like there, but in sunny Devon, it's been raining and now we've got a bit of sun. But thank you very much for everybody for staying on. There are still people here.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, there's a good group of people here, and I'd like to thank all of you. Give me some time to get this recording polished and edited and up, and then I'll do the email and share it to everybody who's attended today. And again, I'll put some details in there for you guys to contact Kellyan or Ant or Tom about next steps. Yeah. And I'll wait for Mark to share the slides he's used today, and I'll make sure that's in the pack as well.